So what did you think of The Last Jedi?
The Last Jedi, I think, is easily the best since Empire in the Skywalker trilogies. So, the three trilogies. And it's in a dead heat with Rogue One for best since Empire more broadly, if you include the anthology films. And writer-director Rian Johnson is one of the better creators working in Hollywood right now. He's much more stimulating and distinctive than J.J. Abrams. So, of course, this was punished by fanboys. It's not even that subversive narratively. It is linear and follows the basic storytelling conventions of the series. It's got a nice action-y climax. I mean, watch a Goddard movie or a Derek Jarman movie, then come back to this. It's pretty tame. The Last Jedi, it subverts some expectations, but it's actually pretty straightforward. It seems people, and by people, I mean largely straight white men in the 18 to 25 bracket, are so used to pop culture pandering that the smallest deviation will be punished.
On that note, Rian Johnson said this about fan service speaking to radio.com. I think approaching any creative process with fan service would be a mistake. Even my experience as a fan, if I'm coming into something, even if it's something that I think I want, if I see exactly what I think I want on the screen, it's like, oh, okay, it might make me smile and make me feel neutral about the thing, and I don't really think about it afterwards. But that's not really going to satisfy me. I want to be shocked. I want to be surprised. I want to be thrown off guard. I want to have things recontextualized. I want to be challenged as a fan. What I'm aiming for every time I sit down in a theater is to have the experience I had with Empire Strikes Back. Something that's emotionally resonant and feels like it connects up and makes sense and really gets to the heart of what this thing is, and in a way that I never could have seen coming.
Yeah, Johnson's bang on here, I think. And when he says giving the audience what they think they want is unsatisfying, he could be talking about J.J. Abrams. It reminds me of a Joss Whedon line, which is, don't give the audience what they want, give them what they need. Now, we have to address the Luke question, because that seems to be the thing people most object to, aside from the presence of characters who aren't white and male. And I honestly think Luke's arc is the best piece of storytelling in the sequel trilogy as a whole. The previous movie actually clearly set up that he'd fled after Kylo Ren turned on him and had been hiding in some obscure corner of the galaxy. So it's weird that people were surprised he was a despairing recluse. I mean, did they just think he was afraid for his life? Or did they, think that maybe he was in despair, which, seems like actually a much more interesting place to take that story. And I'd actually wanted him to be a cynical motherfucker when he shows up looking like Zizek.
Zizek is a Sith.
Yeah, but that's beside the point. Luke's arc is essentially the story of Obi-Wan in the first one, A New Hope, whatever you call it, or Yoda in Empire, the old man in hiding and despair, ultimately inspired by the young blood or the New Hope. The main thing I added to that formula is that he wasn't just hiding to survive, he also questioned the Jedi mythos. So he both criticized the black and white moral framework, which arguably produced both Darth Vader and Kylo Ren by driving those people away with a kind of absolutism. And more radically, he argued that nobody is entitled to the Force. It's not a special preserve of the Jedi. It's in anything, everything, and can be accessed by anyone through meditative practice, which, we also touched on with Rogue One. It's not just the Jedi who can access the Force. So to quote Dan on YouTube's Fandom Entertainment doing his best Bernie impression, quote, "No Force user should have over 1 billion midichlorians." And as an aside, Johnson's 2019 movie Knives Out is a pretty explicit satire of inherited wealth. So the rejection of special bloodlines as a recurring theme of his, the sort of subtext I thought the movie was exploring is kind of made text in this other work, which is more about real world politics. And that movie also had Daniel Craig calling a very online alt-right kid a, quote, masturbating Nazi child, unquote, which felt like payback for the reception of Last Jedi. But back to that film, Johnson presents a very long overdue critique of the Jedi's nature as basically a privileged aristocratic warrior class in decline, something like the late samurai. Perhaps they were needed once, but restoring the institution is a conservative vision. This develops one of the more interesting aspects of the prequel's underlying story, the self-defeating complacency of the Jedi, into something that's actually well executed, unlike the prequels. Maybe people were too attached to their childhood idea of Luke, and they couldn't move on, or maybe they were uncomfortable with the social critique, but possibly both. But they're wrong, and the movie is great. Also, Luke still ends up fighting Kylo Ren with his Jedi powers in full force. So it's not like he hides forever. He's been internalizing a complicated situation in his head, but then he reserves to still fight the First Order because you have to, they're fascists. And he was only half wrong. He kind of had a point about the Jedi, but giving up was no solution. All that being said, it's not a perfect movie. There were a couple of messagey bits that did make me roll my eyes a bit. The major one being Rose knocking Finn off course. And I want to distance myself here from Rogue's haters. The problem here is the hammy messaging, the writer putting words in her mouth, rather than the character herself, who's otherwise good. It's an understandable instinct on a personal level. She's protecting a comrade, and she did just lose a sister. But as a broader political statement about war, that line, quote, "That's how we're going to win, not by fighting what we hate, but protecting what we love," close quote, that falls a bit short as a philosophy, as a political philosophy, in my view. Love doesn't trump hate when fascists are at your door. Or to put it another way, destroying fascist weapons is an act of love. Holdo, and by the way, Holdo is so fucking cool, but she does essentially the same thing as Finn, with the hyperdrive attack, where she goes down with the ship to save the resistance. Functionally, it's the same kind of kamikaze move that Finn attempts. And honestly, the trolley problem is simplified if people choose to sacrifice themselves, knowing the consequences. Granted, both sequences involve an argument that flight can sometimes be tactically preferable to fight. You have to protect what you have, which is true. I mean, Holdo and Leia in particular had a point there. But for one thing, it appears in the cave situation that flight is no longer an option. They're trapped in the dead end. It's not a choice between escaping and a frontal assault. Basically, Holdo and Finn both intend to sacrifice themselves to enable a retreat. So it's a choice between having the ability to retreat and just being wiped out. So, I mean, I got the point about overconfident flyboys, but I think that's better executed with Poe and Holdo, which was, I mean, that was very controversial, but I actually thought that part was fine, because Poe lacks perspective on the whole situation, and he's just wrong, tactically speaking. Holdo has a better plan, and it does involve retreating, but it's a better plan that preserves more of their forces. But Finn kind of has a point. Taking out the laser would help them escape. Calling that an act of hate seems extremely simplistic. And at that point, they had no viable alternatives. So it ties in with the other cringe moment for me, which is the idea that war profiteers selling to both sides somehow discredits the rebels. Now, it is great that they go out of their way to diss war profiteers and wreck their casino. I'm a fan of that whole sequence. But it's kind of shitty to blame people persecuted by fascists for taking weapons where they can get them. Maybe the character who says that is supposed to be wrong, but combining it with the kind of love trumps hate line, it feels like Johnson is gesturing towards a kind of pseudo-pacifism that bothers me. So real pacifism is non-violent civil disobedience. It's militant resistance, but not military resistance. And Hollywood has trouble understanding that concept. It tends to treat pacifism as a purely moral position. It's like the various Doctor Who episodes where after lots of pragmatic violence, they suddenly decide to be pacifists at the last minute, and then they're saved by a Deus Ex from the consequences of that choice. In Last Jedi's case, the Voltex or Crystal Foxes sort of show up to save them from the consequences of the choice they've made and the situation they're in. And it's well-intentioned, but it's kind of clumsy storytelling, I think. Real pacifism involves a sacrifice, taking the violence of the state onto your body, often with the intention of winning over observers, like white moderates in the case of the US civil rights movement. And sometimes people die for non-violence. But in Hollywood, the writers can always wave a magic wand to avoid the consequences of tough choices. So based on what we've been told so far, the last of the organised resistance should have died in that cave. There was reportedly only one entrance, which is where the enemy was all lined up. There was no adequate defences, and without Finn taking out the laser, and then without that Vox Ex Machina, basically on all the information we had there, they were going to get wiped out. So much for protecting what you love. You know, I don't think Finn was trying to destroy what he hated. I thought he was trying to protect what he loved. But all that being said, the Crystal Foxes actually have some interesting historical resonances which slightly redeem the arbitrary plot device. So an article in The Last Medievalist titled How the Last Jedi Outfoxes the Outright points out that in the medieval story, the Book of John Mandeville, some demonized Jewish people who are demonized by the story, in the time of the Antichrist, they follow a fox out the back of a cave to escape persecution. And in The Last Jedi, there's a kind of anti-fascist moral reversal of the story. So rather than being demonized, the characters escaping persecution are the heroes. And they escape in the same way, obviously. So if it's intentional, that's an impressively deep cut. And if it's not, I choose to read it that way anyway, because it's pretty cool. Also, the aesthetic of the Crystal Foxes and the Salt Flats is nice for what it's worth.
Yeah, you don't see worlds that great in the JJ movies, let's be honest. A problem I had too was this idea you're not allowed to portray positively someone committing propaganda by the deed to sacrifice themselves militarily and everybody gets away and it's heroic, because I guess that's somehow evoking kamikazes or suicide bombers or something. But then you look at Rogue One, everybody gave their life in that movie. And look at what their sacrifice did. So for it's just such mixed messages that for one or two people to risk their lives to save more people, when it's their choice to do it, it's their risk to buy people time. It's like, why is there a moral quandary here? I think what Luke does with his force projection in buying time and creating the example, he kind of creates a third way of, rather than somebody putting their physical self at risk and sacrificing themselves to fight somebody or kill somebody, he bought the time for everybody to escape, but it was actually a very passive move. That's how you do nonviolence when you have a damn laser sword.
Yeah, that was quite effective. I mean, he is literally, when I say taking the violence of the state, the way he's portrayed as kind of wearing that violence, and then, of course, the fact that he's not present. But, of course, we're not all Jedi. You know, he's able to do things which other people aren't able to do. Finn disobeys Poe's order, which is interesting because I think maybe there's an idea that Poe has learnt from the previous situation and realizes they should pull out and preserve their forces, and he defies that order. But then in Rogue One, as you say, they en masse defy orders and like sacrifice themselves. And this is a war, you know, like people do sacrifice themselves in war. So to suddenly say, oh, you're trying to destroy what you hate, it's a fairly arbitrary thing, and I just didn't find it convincing. I thought it was just trying to kind of basically shoehorn a message in that didn't really quite fit. Yeah. And I don't blame Rose, I blame Rian Johnson. I think he's generally very good, but I just thought that was a little bit cheesy.
Yeah. I agree on Rose and Finn, and had he died, he'd have had a more solid character arc.
Yeah, he's just sort of there in Rise.
Like Rose.
Yeah, I mean, at least Finn had any screen time, whereas Rose was basically shaved down to nothing, essentially. So Last Jedi is a stimulating and thoughtful entry in the canon, I think. There are some misfires, arguably, but nothing deserving the hate campaign from a vocal minority. And it was successful, both critically and commercially.
Did no one grasp that The Last Jedi was supposed to be The Empire Strikes Back of the sequel trilogy? I mean, does that show what kind of fans they are, the ones that hated it so much?
Yeah, thinking about the training sequences, the whole Luke and Rey thing, again, I think is very interesting. And it's remarkable how much Last Jedi echoes Empire without feeling formulaic. So, you know, in both versions, the Jedi Master, so that's Yoda or Luke, is in hiding on his own in an obscure location. He's reluctant to train the New Hope, so that's Luke or Rey, haunted by what happened with the previous Skywalker. When he agrees to train Padawan, he encourages deep meditation rather than thoughtless action, and that's emphasized in both movies. The Padawan sort of confronts what initially is kind of their parent in a cave, and then it turns into their own face, so they confront themselves in a cave. And, you know, it took me rewatching Empire to realize that essentially the same thing happens, but it's executed quite differently. Then the Padawan has a vision of something that's happening, rushes off into battle half-cocked, and is shocked to find out their parentage. Although that goes a fair amount better for Rey than the end of Empire went for Luke. She comes out a bit better. So all of this has happened before, and all of this will happen again.
Rey has both hands.
Yes.
I find that unfair.
Yeah, she has both hands. She didn't really suffer to the degree that Luke did. Yet even though that strand of the story is technically one big repetition of Empire, it doesn't feel like it. It doesn't feel formulaic the way The Force Awakens does. And I think that's partly because Johnson, and by extension Luke in the movie, is kind of contemplating that repetition and trying to find a way out. It's almost meta, so they're stuck in a formula and want out. It's time for the Jedi to end, and as one meme added, The Simpsons and The Walking Dead should probably pack it in too. Johnson is clearly a huge fan of Empire. He praises it for telling a story in an unexpected way. And he does take that subversion to a slightly trollish level. He's kind of messing with viewers for sport a bit, and it probably helps that I enjoy when directors do that. Like, I loved in the Twin Peaks reboot when David Lynch had 10 minutes of somebody sweeping a bar. So, I'm kind of primed to enjoy when people mess with the audience a bit. But again, it's actually not that edgy. It's still a narratively linear action movie. But like Empire, he kind of gets at the core of the story. So Luke, as a master, may echo the narrative beats of his own master, but it's also different. So while Yoda was old, he was kind of sprightly. Luke is even grumpier, he's more exhausted, more despairing, and of course he resists training Rey for longer, although only half an hour, as the training starts half an hour into the movie, so it's actually not that long, but it's longer than Yoda, and a third war has begun. They've trained 2 successive supervillains. Why wouldn't he be concerned about the way they're going? Why would he have faith in a strategy that keeps failing so utterly? He's kind of an asshole about it, but he's an asshole with a point. Rey also has a point, and she's dedicated, and her dedication is ultimately vindicated. So they're both kind of half right. The Master still has a lot to learn, and his Master returns to kind of give him that lesson to say, actually, Rey had a point, dude. So these middle entries, Empire and Last Jedi, grapple with fear and uncertainty. So to quote BoJack Horseman, Empire uses darkness as a metaphor for darkness, with Peter Shushitsky's beautiful cinematography setting an appropriate tone. Look at the scene with Yoda when Luke in the X-Wing passes over him. The sort of the play of the light and the dark on his face and the background, and then obviously Obi-Wan emerging from that darkness. It's a beautiful movie. But, Empire's a great movie. What's new? There's a commonality between them. So the chips are down, the fascists are winning, but the heroes also have some time to contemplate before the climactic entry. They quite literally meditate. They confront their demons, which is also themselves to a degree, and they begin figuring out where they stand. So, yeah, it was no Rocky training montage. Instead, we're kind of diving into the monk side of warrior monks, the kind of contemplation. And monks are basically academics, so of course I kind of relate to this.
And again, I think when you look at how the other movies don't have much to say, for the short amount of time Yoda is in this, he drops a lot of knowledge.
Yeah.
He says that failure is practice.
Yeah. Failure is the best teacher. And he says that she had the knowledge that the books have.
Yeah, I love when Yoda vacillates between the sage and the trickster.
Yeah.
Because he clearly knew those books were not in there.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that Rey saved the books. Burning books is not cool. Nazis burn books.
Yeah, the symbolism of it was a bit weird, burning books. I understand it's about breaking with tradition, but I am also glad they saved the books. And I don't think burning books is... I do not endorse burning books. I'm going to go on record as saying that. But I did think Yoda, for example, when he says page turners, they were not, I thought that was a good line. Yoda's role in that movie was great and very funny. It makes me appreciate the character anew. Why do people hate this movie? It has the best Yoda since Empire as well, I'd say. And like a good radical academic, Luke still returns to the barricades, which, I can't underline enough The idea that Luke in this movie was just some coward who didn't do anything is maybe based on people being shocked by the first half hour and then forgetting the rest of the movie.
I prefer your reading. He was afraid, he had fear about what he would do or what he had done.
Yeah, that they were in the wrong.
Almost did.
Yeah.
About killing Kylo. That shows the turn back. That shows that he didn't turn to the dark side.
Yeah. He was just being Luke. You know, Luke is a conscientious person. And he was like, okay, I nearly killed my nephew. Then nephew turned evil. Oh no, it's Darth Vader again. Like,
well, it was utilitarian, and it actually became a self-fulfilling prophecy. He was trying to save cause the least amount of violence and destruction and imbalance of the Force in the galaxy by striking down one person, and that he realized.
Yeah, and then he's wondering, is because of the record of the Jedi, is the best way to balance the Force for the Jedi to dissolve? And it's a legitimate question. Have the Jedi just resulted in balance being one big kind of ping pong game where it's always swinging back and forward wildly? You've kind of made the point to me that actually is it Taoist philosophy, balance is flux, there is no equilibrium. So yes, maybe balance is a big ping pong game, but for the people on the ride...
Well, there can be equilibrium, but it can also knock itself out of balance too.
Point being, people have been saying for a long time that what the Jedi do is self-defeating and kind of nonsensical. So Luke just kind of finally brought it up, and then people sort of laid into him about it.
But the thing is that it's equally and opposite true about the Sith. And that's the biggest weakness of Palpatine, that he cannot see. He has a glaring blind spot that he still did not get by the time of that movie. And that's why they were able to take his ass down. Palpatine's mistake was that he believed that as a Sith, he was under the mistaken belief that one side could permanently win. Whether it be the light side or the dark side, he thought that he could make the dark side eternally rule. And the Force does not work that way, and it will not let them work that way. And that was his biggest weakness and his oversight, and that was why he was able to be overthrown. In the same way that the Jedi had their oversight about being one-sided as well, and somehow balance equaling defeating the dark side.
If you realize that, of course you're going to have a bit of an existential crisis. These middle ones, the existential crisis Star Wars movies, Empire and Last Jedi, are definitely my favorites of their respective trilogies. The pattern doesn't hold for the prequels though. Clones middle entry was pretty ridiculous, particularly the infamous courtship scenes. I'd say Revenge of the Sith is the best of that trilogy, although it's still pretty naff in places.
Wow.